We all good? Yes. All right. So today we're going to talk about replacing smoke test selectors with AI. This is kind of a new experiment for me, but I'm going to share some of my results and some of my findings with it, and how two different approaches I take to this technique that's been enabled by LLMs as well as Vision AI. More about me. I've been in computers since I was a youngin. When I was 13, I built my first, and my major projects include one of the first smart mirrors. It went viral, top post to Reddit back in 2015. You can just kind of search my name in smart mirror and you can see my first prototype. And then a couple years later, I built my first house with my then girlfriend from scratch, and learned a lot about carpentry and more like the physical, like building things. And now I'm a dad. So I've got two kids, and I work for this company called Pipedream, which I will actually show the prototype of this technique with you on Pipedream, just because it's the fastest way to build these kind of quick workflows. Yeah, so that's more about me. Onto the fun stuff. So unit integration, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about like unit integration versus smoke testing, acceptance testing. All those definitions sometimes people use differently, I've found. So I'm just going to tell you my version of what I consider each one, and what's so hard about smoke testing now, and how the two different techniques of using LLMs and computer vision are making this, just changing the way this is done, and how it's kind of in the early days, and there's a lot of opportunity to save yourself a lot of time and spending more time with your kids and things you want to do. So what I considered a unit test is testing a specific piece of code, meaning like a function or a class. It's really just inputs versus outputs. It's really highly controlled scenarios. It doesn't involve databases typically. It doesn't involve sending HTTP requests. It's literally just testing scenarios in this tiny, tiny, tiny scenario with those deterministic outputs. The good news is it's really easy to do this depending on what type of language you're using, like Java and PHP, et cetera. I need to do like dependency injection. But when you're working with like JavaScript or Ruby or Python, mocking, or not necessarily mocking, but injecting services is pretty easy. But the downside is, as you probably know, it's very brittle and it's a pain in the butt. It's also executed during your deployments and before deployments as part of your continuous integration process, not necessarily after. Then you move on the next level of complexity, you're getting into integration tests, which is just testing multiple classes that are working together. Most of the time, we're talking about API routes. You're testing an entire API route end to end. If it hits Redis, if it hits MySQL or your database, or an external API. And most of the time, you have to end up mocking some services. That way, you're not actually affecting production data, or you have to like set up an API, external service with specific data and an account. It's just a pain in the butt. So again, it's highly controlled, but it is kind of slow, not just for mocking all these services and clearing a database between each run or each scenario, but also doing the coding of setting up an API service, doing the coding of setting up a mock, tearing it all down between each test. I can tell you so many horror stories, and you probably have them too, of just forgetting to close a DB connection or forgetting to wipe the state completely between these tests, or wiping mocks completely between each test. And all of a sudden your test cases are failing intermittently. And you're like, what the heck is going on? And it turns into a maintenance nightmare. And again, this is part of CI/CD before deployment, not after. So these two types of tests usually catch bugs before they even reach production, in theory. Then we move on to the last type of pre-deployment testing type, which I call acceptance tests. And these are purely UI tests that mock a real browser, that only interface with the code as much as possible through a mock browser like Puppeteer or Playwright. The idea is that you are simulating the user experience as close as possible. And if you thought integration tests were slow, these are like molasses in January. These are very painfully slow because they spin up an entire browser instance, and you have to still set up your app in this special environment to make sure that you are not affecting production data. And you have the scenario, like the user. If you want to test something deeper into your app, into your user's journey, that's after registration, for example, then you'll have to like actually register as a user and then start doing actions as a registered user with a session. Sometimes that involves creating multiple users per scenario, which means you start at the very beginning. You register, you set up your organization in this fake app. You then have to set up different, almost like basically setting up seeding data, so that way you can finally perform the test at the very end of the journey. There's different ways around that, like pre-seeding, which, yeah, you can do that, but again, it requires more setup and tear down, which is a pain in the butt. And this is the final, most high UI visibility test you can do before deployment. Now getting to smoke tests. It's the same methodology as an acceptance test, but the way I've been doing it for years and the way that organizations I've worked with have been doing it over the years is using it against production. And the idea is that you have this scheduled test that gives you a smoking gun if something is not operating the way you expect. So for example, maybe all your tests pass in CI/CD, but in production, there's some kind of experiment that's covering a button or making a button unclickable. The idea is you're testing against production, and nothing is better than trying to mock production than actual production. You could spend a lot of time trying to simulate production in a staging environment or a CI environment, but the closest thing to one-to-one is actual production. So the idea is that you eliminate any possible differences between staging and production and just test against production for some basic user functionality that you expect to work. And that way, if the smoke test goes off, hopefully you get an early jump on a major issue and a major user flow that's affecting the business before users see it. So that's what I'm talking about. Smoke test. It's not tied to deployments. It's just this ongoing scheduled check-in of your service on key interactions, like sending a contact form, which I'm going to use this example a lot because sending a contact form is a highly important business event that indicates a new lead has come in. If you're not getting leads, then the business is not, you can't operate. So that is a simple form that everyone should be monitoring deeply. So that's just some background of the different types of testing. The problem that we UI testers run into is that the modern approach requires selectors. So selectors, for those who don't know UI testing, it's using HTML elements or CSS classes, like IDs or classes, to interact with browsers. So you're literally doing like jQuery-esque selection or CSS selection of elements and trying to use that as your way of interacting through the page. So it's brittle because front-end changes are so frequent compared to back-end, because we're doing all these sorts of experiments to see how users, how conversion rates increase if we make these small changes to the front end, or if we decrease the number of steps, increase the number of steps, change how the form is laid out, introduce multi-part forms that maybe you only show 1 or 2 fields instead of 7 fields at a time to help increase conversion. So the front end is subject to frequent changes, and they don't necessarily, if your teams are separated between like product and QA, for example, maybe you're not communicating one-to-one. They're not telling you when a new experiment is going out. So you're playing catch up whenever a new change is made, and it's causing all these smoke test alarms to go off, and you're just playing this game of this boy who cried wolf. Like the third time the smoke test goes off, it might not be serious. You start to ignore your tests and they start to become less valuable. So unfortunately, the name of the game when it comes to engineering is like product needs and development needs will always be more important than testing. And that's just kind of like a rule when it comes to developing in the business environment. So there's two different ways that I've seen work okay. Adding custom attributes to all HTML elements for easier testing. So you probably use this or seen this before where people add these like specific attributes called like, they are prepended with this word data. And like data quantity, data price. You can actually see this in action if you go over to old.reddit.com. This is pretty cool. You can actually scrape Reddit by looking at the HTML only. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. If you look down in my console here, you can see there's this data type equals link, and you can see, oh yeah, this is a link to a post. You can see if which subreddit it is, so r/learning programming, data-subreddit prefixed. You can see when it was posted, etc. And I assume the reason why Reddit did this was for UI testing. You can even see the number of upvotes and downvotes and comments count this way. It makes it really simple to use Puppeteer or Playwright to scrape Reddit in theory. But I could talk about that more if you have more questions about scraping Reddit and the difficulties there. The other way of doing this is adding static IDs and class names. So you add like literally like a ID to a sign-in button that's called sign-in button, or you add a class name called product to a product. Designers don't particularly love this because of the new wave of designing with like Tailwind styles, for example. I don't know if you've ever seen Tailwind or used Tailwind, but this is a very popular way to describe components using more of like a atomic approach. So this literally says background is gray and it's a light gray because it's 100, rounded XL. So some designers will not want you to put dot product, these CSS classes that don't actually apply CSS, they're just purely for testing. So you're subject to those being accidentally deleted if they think it's extra cruft. So there's two major downfalls to these approaches. Yeah, like I said, these approaches don't work for long because things change. The front end changes much faster, in my experience, than the back end does, because customers see it first. So what if tests were more human? So LLMs and computer vision have enabled two different approaches that I've seen that work pretty well so far. First is HTML-driven assertions, and the second is screenshot-driven assertions. The first approach sounds like it's the same exact as what we're doing currently by using CSS selectors, but instead of predetermining these rules, like of adding the data prefix or using a special CSS class name, and communicating that between the design team and the QA team, instead, what we could do is have the LLM interpret the HTML for us. So what that looks like is you can use large token models that allow us to use the entire HTML body as part of a prompt to an LLM. And so this is a recent thing. I mean, I think it was in, October or November of this past year when these large LLMs became available by OpenAI, where you could use these huge prompts that are, you could stuff entire tomes into. And that's great for HTML because sometimes HTML can be massive. So you don't need to learn about selectors outright. You just scrape the entire content of the page, add to your prompt. Let me zoom in a little bit here so you can see better. I can't even zoom in on here. Sorry. But the prompt says, find the unique selectors for add to cart buttons. You have your cart for an e-commerce site. You have your cart HTML as part of the prompt. And then the LLM will actually find the correct selectors for the checkout if your HTML is semantic and it's readable. If it's just like an SPA, it's where this falls short, if it's client-side rendered. But if you're doing static, server-side rendered or static rendered websites, this approach works pretty well. I'm going to show you how to do it. So I have, let's see here, HTML-driven selectors. This is a workflow in Pipedream. In Pipedream, you can just easily create these like serverless functions right in the browser. So like I said, we'd be making a schedule, like a daily schedule, a check-in on this, we run this workflow. You can do this over a cron, et cetera. And we're gonna look at my website and use the contact form. So there was a little bit of client-side rendering here. You could see that when you refresh the page. It's not exactly, it is. There's just like a funny animation. But this is the page, and we need to grab the actual HTML itself. So I'll just send an HTML request to my page, test this. It's almost like a postman in a way. I just does an arbitrary HTTP request, and now we have this huge list of HTML. And we can use this in downstream steps. So I'm just going to copy the path to that. And now we can use OpenAI to interpret this particular HTML and look for the fields on it. So we want to make sure that we can type into these fields and that they're available for clicking. So for this particular test, since we only have access to the HTML, I'm just going to actually grab the selectors and show you how grabbing selectors over AI is pretty simple. So use the chat. Like I mentioned before, the GPT 3.5 model is the one that allows a large amount of tokens, 16,000 tokens. In particular, this November release, I was close, it was November. So in November, this new release of this model allows this kind of behavior. So what we can do is in our prompt, just say, let me look at my notes, make sure I don't forget the exact prompt. Sorry, just a moment, got a little lost. Okay, so we can make this really generic. We could say, grab the selector for each field in the contact form. In JSON, use the name of the field as the key and as the value, what's the name of the key? Field is the key, and for the value, provide a selector to that field. And then we just simply paste in the HTML from the prior step. And that's like these double brackets just mean like evaluate JavaScript. And that's where this HTML lives, is at this path. I should probably be more specific though, in the provided HTML. So it knows it's expecting HTML, grab the selector for each field, and then provide the JSON. The other nice thing about using like a pre-built action for this is I don't have to remember how to tell OpenAI via an API parameter what the response format should be. I can just click an option here and tell it, please give me JSON, please, please, please. I don't know if you guys have ever had that problem with LLMs where they don't produce JSON unless you like are overly specific. So let's see what it said. Cool. It did work. So it said email address, the contact form, input name equals email. So now I don't have to have my design team follow this strict set of arbitrary rules to make sure we're communicating about the expected placement of selectors. The LLM will interpret the page as long as the fields are named, which they should be for it to work appropriately. Now we can just simply tell the LLM, please find these selectors for me, provide them in a way I can programmatically interface with them. And now we can go over these. I'm just going to show you a concept here.
Dylan?
Yes.
We have a question. It's not related to this here, but will the slides be published?
Oh, yes. So at the very end of this, I have a blog post that I'll share a link to. Maybe you could email the blog post to all the attendees so they get it. But yeah, I will definitely share the slides, as well as I can share this workflow itself, so you can copy it to your account You can just copy that and then just see exactly how this works. And then I'll share that too.
And don't want to interrupt you, but I'm curious about the prompt, because you didn't specify, give me a CSS selector or give me a XPath selector, for example. You just said, yeah, give me a selector. How does the ChatGPT know
Yeah,
what selector you need? Because it's not, okay, maybe you can do some inference to say, okay, it's HTML.
Yeah,
So maybe
but you
that's a
probably
CSS
should
or
be more
XPath
specific.
selector. Yeah.
It's kind of funny, like an inferred, I guess, an HTML selector.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if depending on what your team uses, if you prefer XPath, let's try XPath. I've not actually tried this before. It's a good idea. So let's try that. Let's see if it's smart enough to realize I want XPath, which
Cool.
looks good to me. So like I said, there's downsides to this approach. If you're not using a statically generated app, or if you don't have good semantic clues to what this form does, like I have the word contact form in here as the ID. That might not always be the case. It might just be HTML. It's like it's just as form. But thankfully, the name field should always be there. If it's a normal form-driven, it's HTML-driven form. If you're doing an SPA where there's like a JavaScript like on submit handler, and it's minified or it's chunked up somewhere deep in some minified, code that's delivered over the wire, I don't think this approach will work for you well, just because there's so much obfuscation. But if you have normal server-side rendered templates with HTML, this probably will work pretty well for you. So yeah, you can do it this way, and then further down the road, you could. Well, let me just continue down here. This is a string, unfortunately, so I need to actually parse this back into JSON real quick, just so it's usable. So parse JSON or JSON.parse, paste that in. And now we have an object. All right, and then we can use this object to then, we could use Puppeteer and test it end to end if we wanted to. Just use any Puppeteer. This is just scaffolded code that we can use to generate a new Puppeteer instance. And then we can replace this with our page. And our fields is that path I selected earlier, that parse JSON return value. I'm kind of lazy, so I'm just going to use this AI generator to edit the code and say, for each key in the object fields, iterate over the keys, and for each key is an HTML selector. For each value is an HTML selector. Enter in some static text, I don't know, ASDF for each field with Puppeteer. This is kind of lazy. Like, of course, you should probably be doing like actual name, actual email, a content, but I'm just going to have it iterate over each one and type in field. So for those who don't know, Puppeteer, if you want to type into a field, the first argument is a selector, and the second one is what you want to type in. So this will actually type in ASDF for each field. And this will fail on my site just because there's no email address to actually send it to. I guess if we want to take it a step further, I could type in my email address for each field. And that would work. So it would actually send me an email.
BK Ramsey asks, can it also provide nested selectors like .container, .header?
If you instruct the LLM to, I suppose. That's a good question. This is actually XPath. We never switched it back. So this would be selector to that field. Please be as specific as possible and make sure the outside form container is included in the selector as a prefix. So you have to do some prompt engineering here. You might have to be specific on each type of test you're doing. So if you know ahead of time that there's a container named dot checkout, for example, then you can instruct it to say, look in a specific place. This time it worked. There is a contact form. If you look in the HTML of the site, it was smart enough to realize that there's a class called contact form, or an ID contact form, and it was able to interpret that and inject it as part of the selector, so that way you're being hyper specific. Yeah, it is possible. And if you had multiple forms, I haven't tested this, but it might handle multiple forms as well if you tell it to expect multiple forms and make a multi-nested object for each form. So you'd have a key that has the form name, and then you'd have the value be this collection of fields, for example. But yeah, so this kind of gives you an idea of creating a smoke test. We should receive an email. Please don't spam my contact form with this, but it should send an email every hour. And you can even automate what's cool about Pipedream actually is you can automate the email part. This is kind of silly, but what you could do, you could create a workflow that literally just receives contact form smoke test email. And the trigger of this workflow would be a new email address. So I would just copy this unique email address that triggers this workflow, and then I would paste it into my test. And then you could essentially test to make sure that you receive an email at this workflow. If you don't receive it, then you can make a dead man switch to send yourself a Slack message or, anything. Make a Datadog alert, whatever. So that's just one way of doing this. Yeah, it still has the old selector. I'm still doing the XPath selector. I haven't retested this workflow. But I want to move on to the next type of technique of testing, but this is just one way. I actually think the next type is way cooler, using vision search. So for those who don't know, as part of the November release with OpenAI, they actually introduced this thing called Vision AI. And Vision AI is an LLM, but instead of only considering text as a prompt, you can include images to do general queries against images. So you could do in the past, there was these big, there still are, these big faucets of computer vision, which include classification. Does this picture contain a cat? Or object detection. Where in this picture is there a cat? Or OCR, which means optical character recognition. Extract all the text from this image as best you can. The crazy thing about OpenAI, Vision AI, is it kind of combines all of those. You can just send it general prompts like extract all the text from this page, and it will do that action for you without you having to learn OCR, for example. So this example down below, hopefully you could see it. The prompt is add the cart, add to cart and buy it now buttons visible on this site. It's an e-commerce site. And we just pass in the screenshot of the product page, and then the LLM will tell us true or false. Can I find these two buttons? And it would purely only care about the visual screenshot. We have no context of the HTML. We don't care what the HTML is. We only care about what the user sees. So this unlocks what acceptance testing and smoke testing through the UI are trying to do. They're trying to mock what the user sees as close as possible. This takes it a step further. It's the actual screenshots, not using HTML structure, which is delivered to the user, and we're trying to emulate it and pretend that we can see through programmatically. Here, we're actually using images, which I think is wild. Yeah, it's the closest thing we have to programmatic acceptance testing. You can even do crazy things like emulate a persona. So you would tell OpenAI, I am a 40-something-year-old father of 2. I'm busy. I don't know. You'd give it a persona that your marketing is targeting, and you could say, give me, tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, how good is this design and why, for example. So not only do you have functional testing, but you could do kind of like this persona testing. That's very experimental, but it's kind of neat to mock not just the functional end-to-end, but also kind of like a marketing/design perspective. There's some downsides. Like for now, you can't fully use AI to programmatically interact with Puppeteer. You're just limited to taking screenshots, maybe in the future videos. But I'm not aware of a project at the moment that's trying to add this AI functionality to a browser emulator, which would be kind of neat. So you still have to use Puppeteer code to interact with the website. You can generate that Puppeteer code using AI, but it's not like you're saying one general prompt that says, please end-to-end test this cart, this like checkout flow, and let me know if it doesn't work. You would still have to ask OpenAI or any LLM, please generate the Puppeteer code to do this, and use that HTML structure hack I just showed you. And you still have to manually update it from time to time. But in the future, I can imagine somebody doing this, like end-to-end Puppeteer testing with prompts. But for now, I'm going to show you how to do this vision search concept with a simple checkout flow. I think it's checkout flow. Let me double check my example here that I made. Oh no, I'm using the same exact website again. That's okay. But you get the concept of what I'm trying to drive at here. You can use Vision AI to actually perform the same kind of task without even caring about the underlying HTML. So we're not even going to bother using HTTP requests to get the HTML. We're going to instead use Puppeteer again to take a screenshot. And luckily, there's a pre-built action for us to do that, save us some time. Cool. And then if I just test this, oh, you know what? I forgot one thing. Remember I said in the beginning when I refreshed the page, there's that funny like loading page issue. So I can't just use a screenshot because it'll take a screenshot immediately of those 3 dots, like this funny animation I have. Probably should get rid of it, but it's there. So I can't use this action because it won't provide the correct screenshot. Instead, I'll have to use some code. But it's okay. It's not that difficult. Edit with AI. Oops. Edit with AI. Generate new code. Screenshot the page and wait. So wait, I don't know, 2 seconds, then screenshot the page and return the screenshot as a base 64 encoded string. Remember, I used to like look up documentation and have to figure this stuff out. Oh, you know what? It's not using the existing code. Stop. Try that again. I have to make sure it has context of this Puppeteer thing. There we go. Okay, now it's going to generate Puppeteer code. So it's going to go to Pipedream, which is fine. I'll just edit the screenshot or the URL later. It's going to wait for 2 seconds and then take a screenshot with the base64 encoding and return it. And then I'll just change this URL real quick. Oops. All right, so now we should be getting a screenshot instead. Cool. So now we have a base64 encoded screenshot of representing the page. I'm going to go back to OpenAI and use that same chat action. And now we can use this new thing called the Vision Preview. This is the new version of GPT that accepts images in addition to text. And we can just use this option here to pass multiple images. Cool. So here's our big old screenshot blob, and we can copy the base64 encoding. One funny thing that I've noticed about this technique is that you still have to pass in the MIME type. So the string alone doesn't tell OpenAI what type of file this is. You have to tell it explicitly, like, hey, this is a ping. It's a base64 encoded. So don't forget to do that. Oops, that's the wrong field. Put that in images. Cool. And then we're going to ask it. So let me look at my notes again. Are the contact fields name, email, and message clickable or visible and clickable? So we're asking it literal like vision. Its context is only the screenshot. It doesn't know the HTML. Are there any elements blocking them? Do they appear to be, well, it's just being extra, but you could ask it like, make sure they're not disabled, because disabled usually means gray, like a gray color. For each field, use the, for each field, add a key to the JSON of the field's name. If the field is viewable, set the field of the value to true. All right, let's see if we can get far enough with that. And then make sure we also tell it like, hey, we only want JSON. One thing that, otherwise, if it's not clickable or visible, set the value to false, just to be extra clear. The output needs to be pure JSON, not Markdown. I just had issues with it showing Markdown for this particular model for some reason. Sometimes it just helps to be really specific. So we're just asking it from like, it's almost like asking a QA engineer rather than writing code. It's kind of a funny way of interacting with a page, but this is what's new. The funny thing is here, I forgot to increase max tokens. So it cut off the response because there's not enough tokens allotted for that response. I think that was the issue. I guess we'll find out. Double check. Cool. So the email address field, the name, and the message are true. I never told it that there's an email address and a name and a, I guess I did, email address, name, message. So all those are, that's how it interpreted that. But we could do experiment and see if it's not, if you don't need to actually say these fields, you just say contact fields. But yeah, that's exactly what we wanted. So now we can do a smoke test purely off of this. And we could do the same kind of thing where we extract the JSON and then parse JSON, test this. And we could say, we can make a dead man switch in a way. So we'll make a Slack message to ourselves. If this fails, we'll just say, you know, like unable to view or click on contact fields, something like that to our Slack. And we only want this to go off if any of these are false, right? So we would just create a dead man switch that would filter this. So end execution, if a condition is met, the initial value is that that object that contains these, and we'll say an array, right? If is present in array. I want to make sure that there's no falses in here. So we could do an object, object dot values. This only will extract the values of the things in the array. So this result in all true. And we care about if false is available in the array. And I'm going to wrap in curly brackets. That way it's not saying the string false, but rather the actual Boolean false. And the text type is array. I'm probably using the wrong thing for this, the wrong filter type. Instead, I should probably, I'm overcomplicating this. Instead, we can just literally do that node in node code. So we'll say object.values, like I said before. I think there's something called every. This tests to make sure that every value is a specific thing. So we'll say success. Make sure they're all true. Double bang in JavaScript will just convert anything into a Boolean. Just like cast it to a Boolean. And since you're reversing the negative with another bang, it just turns it back to true. Cool, so they're all true. Passes. If doesn't pass, we'll just exit the workflow. All contact fields present. Cool. So this will prevent us from accidentally sending ourselves a bunch of Slack messages. And don't forget to actually move this step down. Cool. If not passes, there we go. Test again. Excuse me. So now we should make sure that all of our fields are present using this vision technique. Cool. So that's really it. Those are the two different techniques that I've had success with for mocking flows. If you have any questions, happy to answer. And again, I'll share this link with you over email or in the YouTube description or as a comment, something like that. We'll find a way to get it to you. But these workflows also share there. Yeah, so happy to answer any questions. This was helpful.